Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Alexis Badenmer. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. We are your hosts for the North American portion of Regeneration International's People's Food Summit. And I am joined now with the authors and filmmaker of the book and documentary Bright Green Lies, Derrick Jensen, Lierre, and filmmaker Julia Barnes. And hopefully we'll have Max Wilbert pop in a sec. He was having some internet difficulties. So welcome. How are you guys?
We're good. Thanks for having us all on. I'm really honored to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, I just can't believe it. You guys are my heroes. Certainly I knew about Derrick Jensen and Lierre work before, and now watching this film and reading the book, my mind is blown. I'm feeling a little like I should have already known these things. They seem so obvious once they're explained. But there are some things that I was really in the dark about. I spent most of 2019 supporting the Green New Deal, and I did it for good reasons, obviously. Certainly we talk about, building an economy that supports all working class people, make sure everybody has a good job, a green job. We want to support frontline communities and protect them from the effects of climate change. But essentially, like sandwiched in between all of these very good things and good reasons for supporting the Green New Deal, I realized that essentially I had been part of a movement that was sort of tricked into lobbying for the industrial projects of industry. Like I didn't realize, I guess I mean, it seems obvious. Again, I feel so embarrassed now to say like, gosh, I didn't know that. But honestly, before watching your film and reading your book, I did not realize how environmentally destructive wind and solar and hydroelectric energy is. Certainly I knew what was going on with ethanol because of my work on industrial agriculture. So that part of the big green lie I got, but a lot of what's in your book I just didn't get. So I'm embarrassed now, but maybe there are other people listening who need to know. Can you give us the cliff notes on, or actually, how about this? How about each of you tells the audience one thing that you learned that you wish you had known before when you were researching and writing this book, and that you felt like, gosh, I should have known, but here it is.
Well, I'll go first. And what I'm going to say is the one thing that I was really driven home to me is it's not one small fact, it's more an overarching problem. And that is that we used to have an environmental movement. The goal of this movement was to protect wild beings and wild places from destruction. And what that meant was protecting them from industrial civilization, because that's who's destroying them, right? And that movement has been completely hijacked now. Now we're supposed to be lobbying to continue their destruction. We just need to find a new way to fuel it. And that's what's called environmentalism now. So it's no longer about protecting all those creatures we love, all those places that break our hearts because they're being, paved over. So the entire point of the environmental movement has got shifted. It's like right out from under us. It got yanked right out. So I don't blame you at all for being confused, because this started in the late 80s and they've been extremely successful at completely turning the point of this movement into its exact opposite. So you shouldn't feel bad about this. It's happened to everybody who was a part of this movement. And that's one of the reasons we wrote the book, is we wanted to put our love for this planet at the very center of this movement where it belongs.
So you can have 100,000 people marching on the streets of New York or Washington, D.C. or Paris. And if you ask them individually, why are you marching? They'll say, we want to save the planet. And if you ask them for their goals, for some, what are your demands? The response will be, we want subsidies for the wind and solar industries. And it's extraordinary how an entire movement, a social movement, has been turned into a lobbying arm of a sector of industrial capitalism. This is absolutely extraordinary. That's one thing I'll say. And then I want to toss it to Max, because Max has been working on a project that is just such a great example of, the old Vietnam phrase, destroying the village to save it, of destroying the earth to save it. So You can either answer her question, Max, or you can talk about Thacker Pass, or you can do both.
Thanks, Derrick, and thanks, Alexis. It's good to be with you. I apologize for being late. I am in northern Nevada in a pretty remote part of the world, joining from my car because for the last 2 years I've been fighting a proposed lithium mine in this area called Thacker Pass. And it's not a position I ever thought I would end up in because, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I used to think that electric cars were part of the solution to the environmental crisis, to global warming, to all these issues that we're facing. And, I think even then I knew, I imagine you, Alexis, and many other people, we've had this, if you're an environmentalist, you can't help but have a critique of consumerism and industrial production. And, you understand this stuff at some level, right? That's why we're in this movement, of course. But I used to believe this stuff too, like everybody else, because the propaganda is just so relentless and so convincing. There's so many experts and organizations lined up to support this type of worldview that it's hard to break through to the reality of what's really going on. And, I really think that in the future, I don't know how long it's going to be, but in the future, we're going to look back on this period and look back on these experts who promote solar and wind and electric vehicles and so on, like we in the environmental movement today look at so-called scientists who promote fossil fuels and say that global warming is not a real thing and not an issue, right? I think we're going to look the same with the same sort of contempt in some senses, or at least, sort of a pity of their ignorance and their ability, how they've been hoodwinked. I think we're going to look at engineers and scientists and people like, the heads of all these mainstream environmental organizations in the same way. And it's very understandable to me because I think we can all be hoodwinked in these ways. These topics are so emotionally charged, so scary. There's so much fear for the future involved that we all want an easy solution. And so, here in Nevada, this place, this beautiful biodiverse mountainside with springs and pronghorn antelope and cougars and coyotes howling in the distance. And I literally, this morning, I walked down into this little area where there's a spring and I saw 5 owls in about 15 seconds. I saw owls, I saw California quail, I saw towhees, a lot of other birds who I couldn't see, but I could only hear them. I saw a fox last night. I woke up this morning to about 24 chukars wandering around right outside my tent where I was sleeping. And it's an incredibly lush, biodiverse place, like everywhere on Earth is, basically, if you leave it alone and don't destroy it. It's full of life. And this place is under threat, not for a coal mine, not for fracking, not for oil drilling, but for a lithium mine. And that's the world that we're increasingly moving into. It doesn't look much different from the old world. The carbon emissions might be lower, but we haven't seen that actually play out yet because we're seeing these new renewable energy technologies being added on top of fossil fuels. They're not really causing less fossil fuels to be burned. So the new world doesn't seem to look that much different. And I don't know if you have more questions, Alexis or Julia, if you want to jump in there, but I'll start with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in. Something that was really surprising for me while I was doing some research for the film Bright Green Lies is finding out that they're planning on mining the deep sea in order to get at the minerals that they want to produce batteries for electric cars or energy storage for the grid and things like that. Prior to this, I had made a whole documentary about some of the big issues facing the ocean. But I had never heard about deep sea mining, and the more I researched and learned about that, it's quite horrifying what they're planning to do, to send these huge house-sized machines to the, international waters very far out, to kind of rip up the seabed and, probably cause extinction for a lot of the species who live down there. It's a very diverse, amazing natural community in the deep sea. But on top of that, they would pollute the entire water column with fine particulate matter, with the sediment that gets brought up and processed on board mining ships. So, it's really just this massive disaster. The ocean has become a sacrifice, it'll be the next sacrifice zone in the name of green technology. And it just, none of this makes any sense. Like, destroying the planet is not the way to save it. And so, yeah, I think it's really important that people understand what goes into making things like batteries or solar panels or electric cars, because if you recognize how destructive these processes are, there's no way that you can think of these things as being green.
So I do want to go and have this conversation mostly be about the end of the book, where you say what a real agenda is for an environmental movement that really cares about life on planet Earth. I was really shaken by what I learned from the book, and came away with this big picture idea that essentially what industry is planning on is to replace fossil fuels with what are essentially mined fuels, like what you're talking about with Thacker Pass becoming a lithium mine. You talk in the book about mining the deep sea, as you mentioned, Julia, but also silica mining, like basically all of the copper mining, all of the component parts for all of the so-called renewable industries that are supposed to be power from water, power from sunlight, power from air. It's actually power from the mined earth, and stripping everything off of the living planet to get to the part of the earth that they want to mine. Are there any other things that you all want to say about the problem before we start talking about what the real solution is?
I would like to say something that I didn't really answer your first question with what did or didn't surprise me. And the thing that didn't surprise me in the book is that wind energy is ultimately destructive, or solar energy is destructive, lithium mining is destructive. That part didn't surprise me, because for whatever reason, I've long understood that there is no surplus in nature, that if you put something on some land, or if you put something in the ocean, somebody already lives there, no matter where it is. And also, to use your line about the solar, they don't come from the solar tree. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, just that solar panels aren't the fruit of the solar tree. You don't go harvesting them in the fall. Like, they're manufactured, and they're manufactured using that same industrial platform that is in fact destroying the planet. So it just is no way forward. But go ahead.
So I've long had an understanding of that I guess you'd almost call it, I don't really like this term, but you call it full cost accounting, where, okay, so I've got glasses. Where did the plastic come from? Where did the glass come from? How did they make it? I've always had a good understanding of that. So that part didn't surprise me. The thing that surprised me, the thing I didn't know going into the book, is something called Jevons paradox that Max alluded to. Blew me away. And it's pretty intuitive once you understand it. So Jevon was this economist in the 19th century who studied the coal question. And coal was huge at the time and getting bigger. And he asked, okay, so if you make coal use more efficient, how will that affect demand for coal? Expecting that if you make coal use more efficient, coal demand would go down. Because if you can heat your home with half as much coal because you have a more efficient stove, obviously you only got to buy half as much coal. But what he found is that if you increase the efficiency with which you use coal, you increase demand for coal because people find new uses for it. And this applies to basically every mineral and everything.
They've tested 124 different substances. Every last one of them follows Jevons paradox. If we make it easier to use, people will use more of it.
So if you make it easier, if you make it easier to use copper, And if you make it easier to mine copper, so copper is cheaper, people use more. Demand actually goes up. And so what's happened is, and Max alluded to this, is that every fuel source that humans have ever come up with simply added on. So for a long, long time, humans used wood and human and non-human labor, ox to pull a cart. And then let's just jump forward to coal. So coal use added on. Not even wood use went down. Wood use went up because now there's ways you can use coal to get at the wood. Okay, so then oil comes in, and now it adds on top. Coal use continues to go up. Wood use continues to go up. And then hydro just adds on. And this is true with every single one. It's true with solar. It's true with all the others. So even if you could power, that's something we talk about. Even if you could actually power an economy, an industrial economy with wind and solar, which is not feasible for reasons we either can or can't get into. Even if you could do that, it wouldn't matter, because what this is really about is there is an insatiable demand for industrial energy, and they want to find ever new sources. These ever new sources are really expensive, and so they need to find a way to rationalize the funding of the research and development. And I'm not saying that individuals don't care about the environment, but at the sort of industrial level, what's happening is it's a search for massive subsidies. And this is not some conspiracy between, 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 2 self-appointed environmentalists. This is just how the system works.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the industry was getting subsidies for other things before. I mean, certainly the war economy, best example of an industry built around the taxpayers funding the industry. That's why we had the military industrial complex, and everything else followed from that. So yeah.
And I'm sure that dealing with this is associated with agriculture. You have never once encountered any destructive subsidies or subsidies for destructive agricultural processes.
Oh yeah, it's all destructive. Absolutely. Yeah. And they subsidize the worst forms of industrial agriculture rather than the best forms of regenerative agriculture. It seems to be the way it works, that they subsidize the things that corporations profit from at the expense of the rest of us. So any more thoughts along those lines about describing the problem? The book details it so effectively. And if, I would have, a lot of these things, I would have said, oh, that's just the things that the Republicans or the industry that supports fossil fuels, that's just the things they say. The bad things that people say about solar, wind, hydroelectric, etc., that's just what the fossil fuel industry says. No, it's what the real environmentalists say when they really do the research, and you all document it so well.
Thank you for saying that. And I would just add that, the saying is, even a broken clock is right twice a day, right? And I think that we see a lot of fossil fuel aligned political interests parroting some of these problems with green technologies for their own ends, not because they care about the planet at all, because they want to maintain their power and they see a threat to it, and they're willing to say anything. And in some cases, some of the things they say turn out to be true. Some of them are made up, right? But I've been fighting the fossil fuel industry for decades. I've campaigned against the tar sands. I've climbed on top of heavy equipment. I've put my body in front of coal trains. I traveled to the Arctic to study global warming with climate scientists. It's an incredibly serious issue we're facing with global warming. And people should not misunderstand our perspective at all, that we're to imagine that we're somehow promoting that we remain in a fossil fuel powered world. What we're simply pointing out is that no matter what fuel source you're using, industrial civilization is unsustainable.
Yeah.
And if we want to have a living planet, we need to go in a different direction.
I guess one of the things that comes up for people reading books like this is you start thinking, oh, well, I drive an electric car. I do X. When they said you could switch to wind power, I said, yeah, I want to switch to wind power. It's like you think like, well, I fell for this, and you start thinking about your personal choices. But another thing that you make clear in the book and the film is that it's not about personal choices.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the more genius things that the industry has done has been to, shift everybody's perspective so that we're looking at ourselves, and so that we're like hyper focused on our personal consumption and our personal, carbon footprint or environmental footprint or anything, which really takes the blame and a lot of the heat off of the industry, off of the corporations, off of the larger systems that are causing these problems. And it's also not where we have most of our power, is not in our personal consumption, it's not in the way that we spend our dollars. A lot of people say the phrase vote with your dollars. But we actually have so much more power than that. We can organize, we can join groups, we can work together, we can, lobby for obviously changes in where the subsidies are going. We can affect things on a much larger scale. Really what we do in our personal lives is such a minuscule part of the problem.
Yeah. So when you all lay out solutions at the end of the book, the first thing you have on your plank underneath the real reductions that we need to make in the carbon industry economy is the subsidy issue. There's a piece in here about how the commercial fishing industry worldwide receives more in subsidies than the entire value of their catch. Just by taking a position of like doing no harm is a very good start. Another thing that blew me away, honestly, was your list of subsidies for solar. Because as somebody who's been out there in the streets saying, oh, we need good jobs, green jobs, and solar and wind and organic. And so we've been subsidizing this industry. It's not like it hasn't happened. We keep going out into the streets demanding action on climate, but the industry has been getting subsidies for a long time. And you all point out that solar gets more subsidies than the fossil fuels right now, but is producing less energy, less return on that investment. It doesn't even make economic sense if you only were interested in how much energy we could get out of these technologies.
There's sort of a logical way that from an industrial perspective that you use energy. And the first thing you want to do is you want to use the energy that's really cheap and easy. So when they first discovered oil, they basically could scoop it up and burn it. So your energy return on energy invested, EROEI, was 100 to 1. And then when you have to drill for oil, you scoop it first and then you drill for it. And then after that, you drill for it in a place you don't like. And then you drill for it offshore. And then you do tar sands. And basically, that's one way to look at the solar, wind, etc. industries, is that the EROEI is low enough on them that they're really only now getting around to doing them because again, this has nothing to do. Here's the important thing, which is going to take us to solutions, is they're solving for the wrong variable. That all of their solutions, all the so-called solutions to global warming, what they all have in common is they take industrial capitalism as the given, and the natural world is having to conform to that. They say this explicitly. All these big green climate activists say, Bill McKibben, last chance to save civilization. Lester Brown, Plan B 4.0 to save civilization. It's not Plan B to save the North Atlantic right whale. It's not last chance to save migratory songbirds. And so for me, and then I'm going to shut up after this. For me, the first step toward any of our solutions is to transfer your loyalty away from the system and to wild nature, to the land where you live. And we all have stories of we don't want to go back to where we grew up, because when we do, well, the meadows, the forests are now subdivisions and shopping malls, and we all know you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And it's like a doctor friend of mine says, the first step toward correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper cure or proper treatment. And so for me, and then I promise I'll shut up. The first step for 5 seconds, the first step toward anything is being clear about what we are trying to accomplish and what we're trying to save. Naomi Klein is very explicit. She says polar bears don't do it for her. This is all about us. And Bill McKibben's very explicit. Bill McKibben, I'm not saying anything bad about him. He has done more work to raise awareness on global warming than any other person, worked tirelessly. But he says explicitly again and again and again, and I've talked to him about this, or emailed him about this back and forth, and he says he's doing it to save civilization. I'm doing it to save dragonflies.
Which means we're doing different things, because they keep trying to find a new way to fuel the destructive processes, and we want to end the destructive processes. And eventually we're all going to have to make that choice. And that's the problem. And then, we're all going to have to face this. And it is, I'm not saying this is an easy thing, but it's not, technically difficult, and it's not, philosophically or intellectually, this is not a hard moment. The problem is emotional. We're all attached to this way of life. And then we feel a great deal of fear because we don't know how we personally are going to survive without the grocery store and without the car and without the credit card. And we've all become dependent on this industrial system. So we don't know what comes next. And so that makes everybody very afraid. But we have to get past that emotion, because we are literally killing the only planet that we have, and we're out of time. So trying to find new ways to continue to fuel this destruction is not the path that we should be on. We have to admit to ourselves, this was a one-time blowout. Industrial civilization was a one-time blowout. We've used all the metals, there aren't any more. We've used the easily accessible fossil fuels, and every day it gets harder and harder to pull them out. And that's why they've moved on to the tar sands. Eventually this is going to collapse. And really the question is, what's left at the end of it? Is there going to be anything left of a living planet? Anything left of the human race, anything left of any of the forests, whatever, or are we just going to really take it to the brink until it's over? And I would like us to stop while there's still some life left, and let the world try to repair.
All of the technologies that we consider renewable rely on a global supply chain that is separating the consumer from the producer, and the communities that use the energy from the communities that produced the component parts, at least for the energy that people are consuming. There are so many good examples in your book of human communities being destroyed by so-called green technologies. I don't know if one of you would like to take one to expound upon for a moment.
As I said, I've been working on a lithium mine for the last 2 years, so it's close to my heart right now. And we talk about a community in Tibet where a lithium mine was built in their area and poisoned the entire river. All the fish died in the entire river because of the toxic waste emitted from this lithium mine. And the elders in that community are talking about the land being dead. It's an ecological apocalypse, essentially. And this isn't just true of lithium. It's not the case that lithium is a uniquely destructive mining or extraction process. The same is true of iron ore, which is the precursor to steel. And steel is actually used as a proxy for development by the United Nations, by all kinds of agencies around the world. The more steel a country consumes, the more quote unquote developed it's considered to be. And this is one indication that we're going down the wrong path. When a substance that's fundamentally destructive to the planet is used quite literally as a measure of progress, then what you're progressing towards is the death of the planet. It's the death of all species on the planet. It's the poisoning of water. It's ecocide. And, the same is true of copper. I used to live in Salt Lake City. The largest copper mine in the world is just across the valley in the Ochre Mountains. And it's a mountaintop removal mine. It's no different from blowing up a mountain in West Virginia for coal extraction. It's actually on a larger scale than a lot of those coal mines, and it's been going on for far longer. A lot of those coal mines, they rip out the coal and then they at least try to do some sort of restoration. It's a pale imitation, a real farce of the ecological communities who were there beforehand, because they fill in entire valleys and bury these streams and headwaters where these rare amphibians used to live and leave behind this toxic wasteland. The copper mines have been doing that same thing for over 120 years now. And it's an essential component in every wind turbine, every electric car. Whether you're looking at nickel or rare earth elements or silicon, as you mentioned, for solar panels, solar cells, the story is pretty heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
And it's heart-wrenching for the human communities and the non-human community, because I'm sure I don't have to tell you this or the listeners this, but we're animals like any other animal on this planet. We have lungs, we have a circulatory system, we have skin, we're permeable beings. And just like the amphibians absorb those toxins, we do too. And to try and pretend that we're different somehow is silly. And all of this is just it's a dead end, right? And that's why we're trying to talk at the end of the book about solutions and moving in a different direction. I know that's work that your organization has really focused on for many years. I think I saw your either director or founder, Ronnie Cummings, a couple years ago at a conference in Port Townsend, Washington, that I was at. And, this to me is the saving grace, is that there is still a grassroots environmental movement in this world that really understands that the basis for life is the soil and the mountains and the water cycle and the oceans and the natural world itself. It's not machines that represent the future, that represent salvation. It's these natural cycles that we emerge from and that we rely on for everything. That's where we need to put our faith. That's where we need to put our energy and our effort into.
Well, that's a great segue into your list of solutions here, because after you talk about how much we have to reduce carbon emissions, and then you talk about immediately cutting all the subsidies to these destructive practices, and then you state that we must find non-destructive ways of becoming a sustainable society, which means ending fracking, mountaintop removal, tar sands, nuclear, offshore drilling, but also, when we think about it, the manufacture of photovoltaic panels, windmills, hybrid cars, and so on, when you talk about the mining industries that go behind all of that. But then you get to the solutions that come from restoring the natural world. And you talk about restoring the remaining, or preserving the remaining native forests, ending clear cutting, and essentially getting rid of the timber industry.
He wants me to talk about the Southeast Forest, which is, one of the last standing forests in the United States is in the southeastern region. And it's been an ancient refugia since the Holocene. It's one of the most biologically diverse areas in the world. There's like over 400 species that are endemic only to there and live nowhere else. And we can make a list of these incredible creatures that live there, each dependent on the forest, dependent on each other, the way that the web always works. And there are 12 enormous mills there that do nothing day and night except chip the forest. That's all they do, is cut it and chip it. And then these enormous containers float across the ocean filled with the forest, the dead forest, and then they're burned in Germany. It's 40% more carbon than simply burning coal. 40% more when you add all the energy in. 40% more carbon emissions. So they're destroying this last ancient forest, making more carbon than coal, and they get to call it some kind of energy miracle when they burn it in Germany. It makes no sense. It is literally a pack of lies, and we have to stop falling for it.
Amazon.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
No, I don't remember the number.
Well, it's worse than the Amazon.
Yeah, it's like 4 times faster
than they're shipping. Well, yeah, we've all heard about the Amazon, and we should. It's horrible. But, there's other places around the world that are even worse than what's happening in the Amazon, and the Southeast American forest is one of them.
And there's also, if you don't mind, there's a segue I would like to do to solutions that I think may appeal to your organization. The first part is that I come to environmentalism from a fundamental conservatism, by which I don't mean socially conservative necessarily. What I mean is, it's, yes, salmon deserve to live for their own sake and their own beautiful beings. But I also think it's really, really, really stupid to kill salmon that you may need to rely on to eat tomorrow. I think it's really stupid to destroy topsoil that you may need to grow food for you tomorrow. I mean, so I come at all this, like I said, from a form of extreme conservatism. I just think it's a terrible idea to kill all the fish in the oceans so you can have cheap fish sticks now, when tomorrow you're not going to have any fish sticks at all. That's just a bad idea. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that, and don't worry, we're not going to talk about COVID madness too much. But something very, very interesting. I got very interested in the whole COVID thing when, within a week of Wuhan shutting down, a Hyundai factory in South Korea was forced to close. And that's because they couldn't get parts. And this is like 1,200 miles away. And then pretty soon you have people not, being able to get toilet paper or whatever. And the point is that it seems incredibly stupid to me. This is that conservatism again. It seems incredibly stupid to me to have a global economy for food, for critical things like food. The stupidity of that boggles my mind, when you can have a food supply system that is interrupted by a disease, could be interrupted by a war, a landslide, could be interrupted by an economic collapse in a country you've never heard of. And so the lesson that I wish people would have learned from the whole COVID thing, and this is going to come back to a partial solution, is relocalize food systems. It drives me nuts that nobody learns any lessons. Sorry, now I'm just being an old fart who's complaining about everybody. Kids these days don't learn any lessons. But it's like, I don't understand how we've not learned the lesson from global supply chain interruptions due to COVID and due to other things. I don't understand why we haven't learned this lesson, at least on food localization, because without food localization, if it gets interdicted, you die. Sorry, rant over. Now you can go to our previously scheduled solutions. And I hope you see how that applies, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. For those of us who live in cities, we've got a food supply of a couple of days, and anything that goes wrong, that's it.
4 days. Average American city has 4 days of food security, and then you all are starving.
Which is insane.
I know, it's crazy. And people don't want to face it. It's terrifying.
And that's better for the planet. And then I promise I really will shut up for a little while. It's better for the planet to have a relocalized food system anyway.
Yeah, it's what's the average piece of calorie? It's 2,000 calories worth of gasoline just to get it from here to there, or diesel to get it from here to there. It's completely insane, like what we're doing with. And what is everybody going to do when the fossil fuel runs out? And just be serious, people. It doesn't reproduce itself. It's going to run out. You don't need to pick a date. It doesn't matter whether it's 10 years from now or 30 years from now. There's not going to be any more of it.
Yeah. Lierre, you described earlier how, like, this was it. This was the big party. And now we have to see what it's like to go down that hill and not have as much cheap and easy energy, and not have as many things to exploit and destroy. It's like we might have to do things differently. So yeah, I'd like to take it now into what I was kind of shaken up by reading the book. But when it got back to the solutions section at the end, I realized, like, oh yeah, this is what we do at Regeneration International and Organic Consumers Association, because you talk about the one thing in the environmental movement today that isn't a lie, which is that soil holds carbon, there is a carbon cycle, and that carbon cycle can be repaired by protecting the natural world and restoring ecosystems and habitats, and trying to put things back together. And you have a lot of great examples in the book of how we are at a point still where it is possible to repair even very damaged ecosystems. Does anybody want to pick a story from the book about renewal, and the ability to clean things up and restore ecosystems?
Max, can you talk about how incredibly difficult it is to restore peat bogs?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, that might not be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually not very well known, but one of the greatest carbon sinks on the planet is peat bogs.
Yeah.
Almost all of them, I believe, are in the northern hemisphere, mostly in Arctic and subarctic regions of the planet, Scandinavia, Russia, Alaska, Canada. And basically what happens is, you have this saturated wetland area, and this peat moss grows. And as it grows, it just grows up in layers, and the weight of it pushes down the stuff underneath it deeper into the water, and it just grows and grows, and the layers get deeper and deeper and deeper. And so in these locations, you'll get peat that's, dozens of feet thick in some cases, and compressed. Like at the bottom, it's very highly compressed, and it's incredibly carbon dense, to the point that in some places, I think in like Ireland, they have a power plant that runs on peat. They cut out this peat out of old peat bogs, dry it out, and then burn it in a power plant, because it's like coal, basically. It's super energy dense, carbon dense. And a lot of peat bogs in the north have been destroyed over the years by being dried out, and basically for extraction purposes, because peat moss is also used widely in the potted plant industry. So there's big money in peat moss, and a lot of peat bogs have been turned into mining operations, essentially. And to do that, they divert the water flows, so they dry out, and then they can dig out the peat. And to restore a peat bog, essentially all you have to do is fill in the ditch that was dug to drain the water away, and so that the water, stays in the peat bog where it's supposed to be. And that's it. Then you just wait.
No kidding.
And they come back incredibly well. And like I said, they sequester a huge amount of carbon. I think it's on the order of what's sequestered by kelp forests. A similar amount is sequestered by peat bogs. It's a globally significant percentage of atmospheric carbon.
Whoa, that's amazing. That's really cool. So another thing that the language that you all use in this book is a lot different than Green New Deal language, and often different than the language that we use, because, it's always easier to say, let's create incentives. Let's motivate people to voluntarily adopt practices. But when it comes to protecting soil, you all say here in your solutions list, all properties over 60 acres must have soil surveys performed every 10 years. And if they have suffered any decrease in health or depth of topsoil, the lands shall be confiscated and ownership transferred to those who will build soil. So it's, you all are going from a regulate rather than like, voluntary incentives type of perspective on soil. And that's refreshing. We can debate what's going to work the best, but it's very refreshing to hear people say, well, if we really care about something, we should protect it, period.
Well, I am inspired by a lot of my Indigenous friends and the tales they tell about how people were taught to respect the earth. So, for instance, in northern Minnesota, if you were invited to go on the canoes to harvest the wild rice, if you did that in a bad way, you took more than your share, you took more than was available, you took the plants that were supposed to be left alone. If you broke the laws, essentially, that had been developed over thousands of years about how to keep that place, still always fecund and always producing more for the next year. They, had very tight ideas about that, because they had observed, if we take too much here, it dies. If we, so it's very clear, what is the human share that doesn't end in drawdown. And if you were found to break those laws, the first time it was like, all right, well, you can go out in the canoe, but you don't have to touch anything. You have to just do whatever, you can observe what everybody else does. And we're going to make sure that you've learned. And that's good. And usually people would learn because their entire community was putting that kind of pressure on them to say, you've done very badly here. Like these rules are in place for a reason. And this culture has broken every single boundary. Like we've broken the boundary of the atom itself. We've broken the genetic code of other creatures. Like we've punched the face of the moon. I mean, like there's no boundary that stands. Is it any wonder we're destroying the planet? Everybody in the Midwest should be planting perennial grasses, the native grasses, put the bison back on it. We all have grass-fed bison to eat. Like I just give them the money instead. Like why are we subsidizing corn and soy and wheat? That's killing all of us and the topsoil. Like all we have to do is just shift the money and like the farmers will follow because so many of them are so desperately trying to survive and they can't because they're just stuck, every year having to plant more corn to dig themselves in further. Like it's, whether you're a farmer in the Midwest in the United States or in India, your number one cause of death is suicide. Like that's how horrible it is around the world. Like they're just serfs. So, why do we have this whole class of people who are just being driven to utter despair? We can help them figure. It's not hard. Like usually most people who do like grass-based farming, they can make a profit in the first year. It's actually where the money is. So all they need is a little bit of help, a little bit of education. So some of this is quite hopeful to me. And life wants to live. That's the thing. All we have to do is stop destroying and those native grasses come back. I mean, that's the glory of it, right? All we have to do is take down the dams. The fish come back. Like within a week, there will be fish in those rivers.
Yeah, I'm still blown away by how quickly a peat moss bog can come back. But yeah, it is amazing. Like you say in the book, I think the quote is life wants to live. We are still part of a living system that protects life and we just have to step out of the way. I do want to commend you all for taking on the military also. We must commence with the closure of all U.S. military bases on foreign soil. All military personnel should be brought home within 2 years. The military budget must be reduced by 20% per year until it reaches 20% of its current size. This will provide the peace dividend politicians used to promise us back in the 1990s, and it will pay for the domestic programs that we need, starting with biome repair and including food, shelter, and medical care for all. I mean, that's often the elephant in the room that nobody talks about, that the U.S. military, when you talk about polluters, like sure, the fossil fuel companies are really bad, ExxonMobil's awful, but there is one big polluter in the world, and that's the U.S. military.
Yeah, actually, the genesis of that list at the end of the book is in a piece that Derrick wrote during the Occupy movement back in 2011, was it? And, one of the big criticisms of that movement was it didn't really have well-formulated demands. And somebody asked Derrick, could you write a piece about demands? What demands would you have? And that was the genesis of some of that writing that got repurposed into the book here. But I think that, at that event that I mentioned where I saw Ronnie Cummings a couple of years ago, I gave a talk at that event. And the piece that I tried to bring into it was that the conference was really focused on restoration and soil and small farmers and permaculture and so on. And I was trying to bring in the element of resistance because I think that, just as Lierre gave the example of an individual who doesn't abide by the rules of the community and sort of exceeds the carrying capacity of the land, and the community has to hold them accountable. We're living in a world now where there are entire governments and massive international, multinational corporations that are doing the exact same thing. And they're protected by an armed military. They're protected by a system of laws. They're protected by, a court system and a social system that teaches certain ideologies, right? So in a way, that person is that person who's running 50 sheep. They kind of took over, right? We're in a situation where they're dominating our economics, our politics, our entire world.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so important that we have people doing permaculture, doing the food relocalization, doing all these things. And I think we also at the same time have to focus on stopping the destruction of the planet. And that's something that we try and lay out very clearly in the book, is that, you know, the world knows how to heal itself. And in so many ways, the most important task for us is to stop the destruction and stop the ongoing ecocide of our entire planet. And if we do that, if we just get out of the way, the land will be fine. The land will heal. And I think that's an important piece to throw out there, because, you know, I think it's really tempting sometimes to just think that, you know, permaculture and regenerative agriculture are going to sort of win over people in a marketplace of ideas, because the grass-fed beef is so much better and the organic produce is so much, you know, I'm eating some of my dad's tomatoes from his backyard and they're outrageously good right now, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's just night and day compared to a cardboard tasting pale tomato from a big supermarket chain or something, right? That's true. But at the same time, you know, the world is dominated by those multinational chains. It's not dominated by people like my dad, and they're investing huge amounts of wealth and energy, just pushing us in the wrong direction. So I think that it's really important that we recognize that. I don't think we're gonna win people over just purely by things being better when we do things in collaboration with the planet. I think that it's going to take political organizing. It's going to take conflict. That's the lesson of every historical struggle, every civil rights movement, every resistance movement throughout history, is that when you have entrenched systems of power, it takes organized political resistance to uproot them. And that's something that we're going to need to do ourselves as well.
Yeah, I feel like that comes across really well in the book and the film. If I had to summarize what your book and film say to me in one line for what to do, is to pick something that you love about the natural world and protect it with everything you have. And I think it helps also to be specific, like what you're doing, Max, is real specific. Like you're protecting one place from one extractive industry, and it's very concrete, and so it's not really debatable. Somebody can't say like, oh well, that powers solar, you know, it's good, because you're like, well, look here, this is not good and we have to protect this. So it's not really open for debate. If we just engage that directly, it all makes sense. And then in some ways, you don't need books like this. You don't have to explain all of these myths and lies, because if everybody were just focused on protecting one thing that they love that needs protection from the industrial world, you know, we'd all just be doing it. So we're sort of wrapping up now. We've been talking for a little more than an hour. Let's do a round of final thoughts. How about we start with Julia? You haven't gotten as much speaking time, so take as much as you like.
Yeah, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that most of the oxygen in the air that we breathe actually comes from the ocean. So plankton, phytoplankton in the ocean produce anywhere between half and like 2/3 of the oxygen that all of the land animals need. And the ocean is also the largest carbon sink on the planet. So the deep sea, in fact, is the largest active carbon sink that we have. So yeah, it is something that people don't usually think about, but it's totally part of the carbon cycle. There's a huge exchange between the sea and the land.
Final thoughts.
I want to just jump in on what Julia said, that 2 out of 3 animal breaths are made possible by the plankton. And the plankton are all collapsing because the oceans are now too acidic. And they're too acidic because we've burned all this carbon. And the oceans are trying their best to absorb it, but it makes them very acidic when they do this. They're also kind of at capacity. The oceans aren't going to help anymore. They've absorbed everything that they can. There's not much more buffering they can do for us. And at that point, it's just runaway global warming. So I just want everybody to understand the level of emergency that we are really in right now. And whatever you love, it is under assault. And we have got to let that love call us to action.
And the big distinction is not between those who want to bring down everything and those who bring down, industrial civilization and those who don't. The big distinction is between those who do something and those who do nothing. As I've said before, I think one of the most important thing is to transfer your loyalty away from the economic system and to the natural world.
When I got started as an activist, I just went to meetings and just sat there and listened. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what the hell was going on. I didn't have any intelligent additions to make. I wasn't leading anything. I was just showing up. But I was there because I felt like it was important, and that's the most important thing, I think, is that when you're doing this work that you follow your heart. And if you do that, and if you keep listening and don't, squash those feelings like the culture tells us to do and teaches us to do, then you're going to be led in the right direction, I think.
Well, I love this book. I love this movie. I'm so happy that I came across it and got to talk with you all. And it's great to have a big conversation like this, but I hope that each of you as individuals will be interested in sitting down with me in the future as things evolve and you have important information to get out there, because I know you're doing that every day.
So I don't know if you and Lierre have already had this conversation, but you've read Veg Myth, right?
Yeah, we've already talked about this.
Okay, because Lierre's fabulous.
So actually that's how I found you all. So I found Bright Green Lies because I was looking back at Vegetarian Myth. It took me a decade to read the Vegetarian Myth because I was a vegetarian.
I get it.
Ready to not be a vegetarian anymore. I read the book and I was like, gee whiz, how about all this stuff? Sometimes it's not easy to convince people, but it is very important for the information to be available to people when they decide
they're ready.
And that's why that's what Bright Green Lies is going to do. I think, like you all said, like we're going to look back on this era and say, gosh, I can't believe how the corporations fooled us into going for all this environmental destruction under the name of saving the planet. And and Bright Green Lies will be there when people wake up. So, but in the meantime, everybody listening to this, please spread the word, share the movie, share the book, share this conversation to inspire people to read it and watch it. Bright Green Lies, and it's brightgreenlies.net?
.com.
brightgreenlies.com. You can find the book and the movie there. It's available to stream instantly. And you can get the book on all platforms. And there's an opportunity, there are links at brightgreenlies.com to buy the book directly from the authors. All right. Thank you guys so much for everything that you all do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Alexis Badenmare. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. This conversation today is part of Regeneration International's World Food Day broadcast, and it is under the banner of the new MDs, the moms, the doctors, and the scientists who have put their brains together to figure out what's making our children sick. What's Making Our Children Sick happens to be the title of a book by Dr. Michelle Perro. We also have Dr. Stephanie Seneff with us. She's the author of Toxic Overload. And we have Zen Honeycut from Moms Across America, and she's the author of Unstoppable. And honestly, I just can't believe that I'm with you three right now. You three are my top heroines. And I remember the moment that I became aware of each of you. Actually, Zen, I don't remember the exact moment because I think I came to understand what an unstoppable force you are over time working together as activists. But I remember seeing Dr. Michelle Perro in Jeffrey Smith's films. And right before this conversation today, I just went back and rewatched Secret Ingredients. And for anybody who's watching, who wants to, we're going to get into some stuff today in this next hour, but there is so much more. And so if this is all new to you, you need to go back and watch the films Secret Ingredients and Genetic Roulette and get in touch with Institute for Responsible Technology and Jeffrey Smith's work, because that's how I became aware of you, Dr. Perro. And then I think it was Zen. I think you were the person who showed me Dr. Seneff's work. Dr. Seneff, you published a series of just mind-blowing articles explaining exactly how glyphosate, the pesticide that we're exposed to more than any other, how that causes all of these diseases that are now so common, whether we're talking about allergies or eczema or anything related to gut dysbiosis, if we're talking about kids' behavioral issues or learning disabilities, and those are the basics, the baseline that most people are dealing with today. You managed to explain how the body's systems, how this toxin comes into our body and then results in those various problems. And I only scratched the surface. So I don't even know where to start, but we also have breaking news here, because Zen Honeycut has done a brand new study getting into what's in school food. And that just blows the lid off of all of this, because, we think of this as a private problem, something, as individuals, we deal with our health, we talk to our doctors, we examine the science. But this is a societal problem. And I'm so happy, Zen, that you took this on to look at what kids are eating, millions, hundreds of millions of kids eating every day. And so why don't we start there? So Zen, why don't you introduce us to your study, and then we'll get Dr. Perro and Dr. Seneff to weigh in with their expertise.
Thank you so much, Alexis. And I'm so glad to be here with Dr. Perro and Dr. Seneff as well, to hear their perspective on what all this information means. We decided to test school lunches because obviously there's so many children that are impacted by it. There's 30 million GMO meals that are served each day to our children in schools, breakfast and lunch. And for many children, that is the only food that they will eat. The poverty levels in America are astounding. So we felt that this was incredibly important, because we know that 1 out of 6 children now has a learning disability. 1 out of 5 Americans have mental illness. 54% of the children are chronically ill. So, something is impacting them, and we believe it's the toxins in the food supply. And what better than to look at the school lunches than to figure out what's going on here. But we knew we shouldn't just test for glyphosate, because so many farmers are moving away from glyphosate now because they're learning about the harms of glyphosate, which I'm sure Dr. Perro and Dr. Seneff will talk about. So we thought we really should test for all of the most egregious pesticides that are in the food supply, as well as what glyphosate and AMPA. AMPA is the breakdown of glyphosate. So we had the lab test for 220 different pesticides, the most egregious ones. And I have to point out that we made sure that they tested for the ones that were most widely used. And I have to say that because the FDA, the USDA and the California Department of Food and Agriculture, they will put out data saying, 98% of the 1,200 samples that we tested for this year for pesticides were not above the detectable level, right, of pesticides. But when you go and look at what are they actually testing for, and you look at you compare that list of, say, 200 pesticides, and then you look at the list of the most widely used pesticides, out of that top 25 of the most widely used pesticides, you will only find 3 of them on the list that the USDA and that the California Department of Food and Agriculture test for. And I know this because I was on the organic advisory committee in California, and I compared those 2 lists. And when I brought this to their attention, in the meeting, I was not a very popular person because they didn't want that news to be, out there. So we tested for the most widely used pesticides. Okay. So glyphosate, 220 of the most widely used pesticides. And then 108 different veterinary drugs and hormones. And we also tested for the 4 top heavy metals, most widely found heavy metals, ones that were already found in baby food. And then we also tested for a dozen or so nutrients, because we suspected that the nutrients would be sorely deficient. So that was the goal of the testing, to get a very broad view of what's going on. Of course, we could have tested for phthalates and PFAS and, BP, like all different kinds of things, but that's what the lab was able to test for at that time. So should I get into the results? I guess. Yeah. So the results were 95.3% of the school lunches were positive for glyphosate and AMPA, and not at low levels. Some of them at very high levels, like 258 parts per billion, and anything above 25, according to the lab and previous studies by Michael Antonou of the UK. Anything above 25 could be directly correlated to liver disease, according to the rat study that showed that 4 parts per billion per kilogram per body weight contributed to liver disease. So in humans, about 25 parts per billion would contribute to liver disease. So I'm sure Dr. Perro has a lot to say about liver disease. And then the results with the pesticides was 74% of the samples contained at least one of 29 different harmful pesticides. And these are pesticides that cause tumors and cancer and endocrine disruption, embryonic toxicity, all kinds of things. In addition, we found 4 veterinary drugs that they were found in 9 school lunch samples, and some of them at levels up to 130 parts per billion. And that's not a low number. The lab technician was shocked to have found that much. He's never found that much in any other samples before. And then 100% of the school lunches were positive for heavy metals. And these levels were also not low. They look low if you look at that. Some of them were 2 or 17 or 29, all the way up to 94. I'm guessing that a layman would be concerned about that. But when you compare those numbers to what the EPA allows in water, it's shocking, because what the EPA allows in water is like 0.015 of lead, 0.005 of these other heavy metals, 0.5, very low levels. So when you do the math, 94.4 parts per billion of lead found in a bread product, I believe it was a pretzel, is 6,293 times higher than what the EPA allows in water. I mean, it just doesn't make sense that this would be allowed in our children's food supply. So the heavy metal levels were shocking. And I'm sure, Dr. Perro will talk about what that means in our children. Heavy metals are extremely concerning. And then, of course, with the nutrients, as you would suspect, they were very low in nutrients. In fact, one of the advisors gave back his analysis that at least 50% of them, the majority of them had 50% or less, some of them almost none of the, close to none of the minerals that were being needed for the recommended daily intake, right? Like, I don't want to say none, but very, very low levels, which would be needed for the recommended daily intake. If this school lunch was, say, 1 out of 4 meals, a snack and 3 other meals that were consumed, they would be getting definitely less than 50% of what they're supposed to be getting for their recommended daily intake. So our kids are besides being poisoned, they're being completely devoid. Their meals are devoid of nutrition, which is essential for thinking and for behavior and development. So the results were horrifying, to be honest, and far worse than we thought. Because when you look at even just the glyphosate, 95.3%, when you look at the Detox Project testing that was recently done, about 60% of the samples tested in the grocery store were positive for glyphosate. So 95.3% is way higher than what the average American is eating, in grocery store food. And it's extremely disturbing that we'd be treating our children this way.
So Dr. Perro, Dr. Seneff, who wants to go first reacting to this news? It's not good news, but are you surprised?
I'll chime in from the health perspective, and then Stephanie, you can give us some of your amazing insights. And thank you, Zen, for this project. And the most shocking thing is that the moms have to take this on. Of all the shockers, and the whole study is shocking, not surprising, but yet shocking, is why our government's not doing this. But that is indeed another conversation. All of this is horrible news, but I want to look at that nutrient density in those heavy metals, because that was surprising to me. I knew our food was contaminated. To find 100% contaminated with heavy metals is serious business. And you have to appreciate there's 2 factors. That one, American children over the past 2.5 decades since we've introduced GMOs and their associated pesticides have developed intestinal issues. American children now have leaky gut, where their guts are like porous and foods are passing with other toxic chemicals and metals into their bloodstream. So that's a problem. Constipation, kids are refluxing, their tummies are bloated. And don't forget, there's this thing called the gut-brain axis, where the gut chats with the brain. If the gut's bad, the brain is bad. There's this relationship, and it's actually the gut-brain microbiome, those bugs in the gut. When kids are nutrient deficient, which if this is all they're eating, they're going to clearly be nutrient deficient, as well as the normal metals. The heavy metals get taken up more. So these kids take up more heavy metals. So they're passing into their bloodstream, and because they're so nutrient poor, they're even getting a bigger dose of these heavy metals that are really hard to get out. What's the problem with these heavy metals? So glad you asked. Well, the biggest problem is neurocognitive dysfunction, meaning learning. What are we seeing an explosion of? ADHD, like the literature says 10%. Oh, it's way higher than that because a lot of kids are not officially diagnosed. Autism, since I wrote that book, it was 1 in 58. It's now 1 in 30. Every type of neurologic processing disorder, from kids who can't read, who can't hear, who can't have abnormal sensations, picky eaters, hypersensitive children, that alone, and all the behavioral disorders that stem from that. School, home, sleep, and eating. So we have this, we can focus on, like, I just read a study about aluminum and asthma, aluminum causing asthma in a recent paper. So these metals are not benign. Neurocognitively, autoimmunity, respiratory atopic diseases, which are allergic disorders. So this is profound. A number of pesticides, profound. No studies looking at when the kids get all these together, the toxic effects. So we think Roundup is bad, glyphosate-based herbicides. Some of those fungicides in there are just as bad, if not worse. And then all the adjunct chemicals like the butoxides, and I hope Stephanie can go into that, the piperonal butoxide and other chemicals, they're all bad. None of those should be there. None of this should be in our kids' food. So health issues, profound. Who's monitoring it? You know, other than moms, bravo, Zen and moms. But now we, the new MDs, are going to pick up on this, and we're going to change the conversation. And I'll hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very, very informative. I can go on and on about glyphosate. That's the subject I know the best. In my book, Toxic Legacy, it explains exactly how glyphosate disrupts so many things in metabolism, and certainly messing up the minerals, both causing the minerals to be deficient and actually causing the minerals to be distributed incorrectly, such as they become simultaneously deficient and toxic. And I wrote an article about manganese, for example, and manganese deficiency systemically, but manganese toxicity in the brain, in the center of the brain, because the manganese is being distributed in a very odd way, because glyphosate chelates the manganese, makes it unavailable to the gut microbes, messes up the body's natural mechanisms of distributing it, and ends up with it concentrated in the wrong place. And I think the same thing is happening with aluminum. So it's ironic that you have both deficiencies in these critical minerals that are nutritionally important and biologically active, that they catalyze many enzymes, the manganese, the magnesium, the zinc, the cobalt, the copper. And I believe those were the ones that Zen pointed out as being extremely deficient in the food supply, which is not at all surprising because those are the same ones that glyphosate, Don Huber showed tremendous reductions in the uptake of those minerals into the plants as a consequence of glyphosate exposure. And another one was sulfur that he showed was dramatically reduced. And of course, then didn't test for sulfur. Sulfur doesn't have a minimum daily requirement. The government thinks there's no problem with sulfur. I believe we have a crisis in sulfur deficiency in this country, and that a large part of that is due to glyphosate, not only making sulfur unavailable to the plants that we eat, but also completely disrupting our metabolic processes by which we handle sulfur in the gut and systemically in the body. That's a lot of what I wrote about in my book, the issues with sulfur. And the autistic kids have a very clear sulfur issue, and in particular, a sulfate deficiency problem in the brain that I wrote about before I even knew about glyphosate. I had a paper that I worked on with a student of mine. In 2012, we published a paper showing all these different ways in which it looked like sulfate mismanagement was connected to autism. And in my book, I talk about many different ways in which glyphosate disrupts the sulfate system. So all of that is very, very interesting to me. And it's amazing how clearly it all fits. It fits together. That's what I was really struck with glyphosate. And, you know, Zen mentioned fatty liver disease. That is a tremendous epidemic in our country right now. And I think Zen said in her article, 1 out of 3 people in this country suffer from fatty liver disease. And there was a study that I wrote about in my book where they looked at people who had fatty liver disease versus those who didn't. And that's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD. And the ones who had more severe cases versus less severe cases, 3 different groups. And they showed statistically significant differences in the levels of glyphosate in the urine among those 3 populations. Very, very striking to say that correlation between the fatty liver disease and the amount of glyphosate that showed up in the urine in the tests that they took. That's really remarkable to me. And of course, studies have been done on both mice and rats to show that minute amounts of glyphosate exposure over a period of time causes fatty liver disease in these rodent models. So that's really, really striking to me. And so you've got the liver damage, the liver disease, you've got issues with bile acids, you've got issues with fat digestion, you've got issues with protein digestion. You end up with too much nitrogen in the colon that causes pH problem. I mean, it's just an incredibly complicated and shocking amount of disruption that happens when you are chronically exposed to glyphosate. And the thing about glyphosate is that it is insidiously, cumulatively toxic, and it's a slow kill. And the regulators have not seen that. They have been able to be blind to the fact that glyphosate is causing tremendous disruption of our metabolism over a long period of time. So it's really the accumulated experience you've had with, now glyphosate was introduced into the population in 1975. That is a very long time. It's now 2nd, 3rd generation showing up. And it's showing up in our children with all this toxicity that they and their parents, and even sometimes their grandparents, have been exposed to. That's causing these tremendous problems that we're seeing with our children. All these diseases, obesity, diabetes, as I said, liver disease, kidney disease, Alzheimer's, autism. There's a huge list of diseases, pancreatic cancer, that are going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. And people say correlation doesn't mean causation, but I say if you see that kind of correlation that's so striking, you better find out what is the causative mechanism by which this chemical could cause that disease. And that's what I talk about in my book. I can give specific instances with each of those diseases, why glyphosate would be predicted to cause that disease, given its insidious cumulative toxic effect, which is to substitute for glycine by mistake in proteins during protein synthesis. And it's quite an interesting story. And you can find the specific proteins that have what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif that's going to make them especially sensitive to glyphosate substituting for critical glycine residues, messing up that protein, causing that disease. And I can do that for all these diseases that are going up.
Wow. So much to unpack there. Stephanie, I could go for about 6 hours unpacking that, but I just want to hone in on one of those pieces you said on how it affects the health of children. And there was so much we can look at, but I want to look at the liver. Let's just go back to that liver issue because it's bigger than we think. Zen mentioned 1 in 3 adults have this fatty liver. It's called non-alcoholic, since it used to be that alcohol was the most common cause of fatty liver, but now it's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It was 1 in 4 just a few years ago. Now it's 1 in 3. Well, what about kids? Well, for kids, non-alcoholic fatty liver is about 13% of them. In obese children, which is now affecting 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 children, depending where they live, economic status, ethnicity, etc., it's about 1/3 of them have fatty liver. And in one study out of Italy, I saw a significant number of the obese children with the fatty liver went on to NASH. NASH is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. It is the sequelae of fatty liver, which goes on to fibrose, meaning harden, eventually leading to something really bad called cirrhosis, where the liver fails. What's so important about the liver? Everything. It's your major organ of detoxification. It cleans up a whole bunch of stuff. It produces vitamins. It helps with cholesterol synthesis. It stores carbohydrates. There is so much that your liver does. These issues, both the fatty liver and the more serious sequelae, it's called NASH, NAFLD and NASH, is that they're silent. And the only way you can pick them up is on an ultrasound. I can tell you, practitioners who care for children are not thinking this way and not screening people. And as an aside, I can tell you that they're not doing that. As an aside, when Stephanie mentioned the lack of enzyme production by the pancreas, and your kids can't break down fats, adults can't break down fats. When I screen these kids, they have fatty poops. And when I look at their digestive enzymes, they're so low. And then when I change their diet, I need to support them with some digestive enzymes and rebalance the microbiome and give them bile acids. I mean, this is complicated. It comes back up. I'm working with someone right now. Half her food is filled with glyphosate. It gave her NAFLD, and now she needs digestive enzymes until we rebuild it back. This is outside the purview of traditional conventional medicine, and our practitioners are not equipped to deal with the problems that we are artificially creating, unnecessarily creating.
Well said.
Wow.
Very significant. Yes.
Well, I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I do have I do receive hundreds, if not thousands, of stories, anecdotal stories from moms, and I also read a lot of science. And one of the stories I want to tell, 2 stories in relation to this, and and get Dr. Michelle and Dr. Seneff's reaction to it. To them. One of them is about the hamsters. There was a study I saw in Smithsonian Magazine, and there were hamsters in Germany. And the farmer noticed that the hamster population in his monocrop cornfield, we know what that means, most likely GMOs with glyphosate, were rapidly declining. And he was, I guess, a very considerate farmer because he was concerned about his hamsters, and contacted a local university and asked them to come out to study what was going on and why was this population of hamsters in his cornfield declining. So they reproduced the whole study. They got the hamsters, they got the dirt, they got the corn, they got everything that was being used in that field. They reproduced it in the lab. And what they noticed was that the female hamsters were cannibalistic. They were eating their own young on the first day of life.
Wow.
And when they studied the hamsters, they noticed that they were completely devoid of one vitamin B3, and the precursor, tryptophan. But that was the only vitamin. And so when they administered vitamin B3, the cannibalism completely stopped.
That's amazing.
Yep.
So wouldn't you, as a doctor and a scientist, and Alexis as a mom, wouldn't we wonder, like, wait a second, what if there's just some vitamins missing in our kids who have violent and aggressive behavior, and adults for that matter? Shouldn't we be looking at what their vitamin levels are? And wouldn't you suspect that this monocrop culture, farming with all these chemicals and fertilizers would be contributing to that deficiency? I don't know the science behind that. Do you, Dr. Seneff? How could maybe perhaps corn be completely devoid of vitamin B3? What would be, is it the body of the hamster? Like, what is going on there that would make that happen?
Right.
And do you think it's happening in children?
I think that's very, very interesting. And of course, I have looked hard at tryptophan and its products. And in fact, tryptophan is a precursor to niacin, which is vitamin B3, but it's also a precursor to serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter in the brain that's associated with sort of love and feeling and good feelings. And in fact, when you have serotonin deficiency, things like obesity is connected to serotonin deficiency, violent behavior, depression, they're all connected to serotonin deficiency. So you have this tryptophan, which is produced as a product of the shikimate pathway, which glyphosate famously disrupts. So it's disrupting the shikimate pathway in the foods that the kids are eating and also in their gut microbes. And so they have a deficiency in tryptophan, which leads to a deficiency in both serotonin and niacin. And niacin is so critical for metabolism. So then they have their metabolism is defective. They can't make enough ATP. I mean, there's a huge number of consequences to having insufficient niacin. It's absolutely critical in the mitochondria. And then if you're drawing it towards the mitochondria, you're missing out on the serotonin. The brain doesn't have enough serotonin. Serotonin is also sulfated in transit, and it's delivered to the brain in a sulfated form. That sulfation pathway is also disrupted by glyphosate. So glyphosate disrupts both the synthesis and the transport of serotonin, which results in a serotonin deficiency in the brain, which then actually induces excess dopamine production, which is associated with autism and also with ADHD. So there's a huge cascade of issues that come about, starting with glyphosate disrupting that critical shikimate pathway that produces the tryptophan.
And and I might add as well regarding this very same pathway is when we disrupt the microbiome, because glyphosate is also an antibiotic, and then you have an overproduction of Clostridia, and what is common in kids on the spectrum is a too much Clostridia type of species, and because now you become dysbiotic, where your microbes are out of balance. Not all Clostridia is bad, but when it becomes a pathogen, because you lack the balance of microbes, those Clostridia produce certain chemicals, P-cresol and others, which then also change the brain chemistry. And you have too much dopamine and excitatory chemicals in the brain, which then causes these kids to be out of control, ADHD-like symptoms. So again, it's another mechanism on how these pathways are affected via glyphosate. So very interesting. One more aside about that niacin. I read a paper recently how they're using niacin in treating people with COVID and long COVID.
I saw that too.
And they're finding that it's very successful. I'm thinking, well, these people who have long COVID, are they just filled with glyphosate, and what are they eating? And
Exactly.
they all deficient. So the people on COVID, the shooters, all the violence out there, how much glyphosate's in their urine? Because according to the CDC, 80% of us have glyphosate in the urine. And if you're a kid on a school lunch, it's probably all of them.
Right.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be laughing.
Dr. Perro, have you seen children with aggressive behavior be deficient in vitamin B3 or any type of vitamin? Is that at all connected?
I've seen a global in kids on the spectrum when we test their nutrients, for those we can get a hold of, they're globally depleted. They're low in all the vitamins, the B12, the B3, the B6, zinc, magnesium. They're just globally deficient because they're malabsorbing, because they have intestinal permeability. Their microbiome is deficient. They have really lack of heterogeneity of their microbes because of many factors. So one of the tools we use to get these kids on back is heal their leaky gut, rebalance the microbiome, and restore nutrients.
So it's not just that the food is just completely deficient of vitamins because of the agrochemicals in the food supply. It's also because when the vitamins get into the gut is permeable, and so the vitamins go out. So they're not absorbing it for two reasons, is what you're saying.
Right, they're malabsorbing, and if they're taking any fat-soluble vitamins like vitamins A, D, E, and K, those are fat-soluble vitamins, and they can't break them down because their pancreases aren't working very well. They're just probably malabsorbing those things. They're going right out. You have to be able to absorb the nutrients that we're consuming, and that's what this whole system is, from the mouth to the end. The bottom, the tush, is all about extraction of nutrients as it passes along out the other end. And we have many systems in place along the whole route to help us. And our biggest friends that help us along are the microbes. And we're literally killing off the microbes. So we're binding up the nutrients. We're killing off the microbiome. It's a perfect poisoning system.
Yeah, and cobalamin is another B vitamin that's really problematic and deficient to many people. And that one, it's very difficult to get that properly absorbed. And many people can't absorb cobalamin. Even they take high doses, it just goes straight through. And that's because of the complicated, way in which cobalamin is absorbed doesn't work well in the context of glyphosate. Glyphosate messes up the absorption of cobalamin. So you can't get enough even if you're taking it orally.
And that's the B12. And that's why so many kids, for example, on the spectrum wind up doing a lot better when they get their injections of B12. And it has to be in a certain format that they can inject it. It has to be methylated, because many of these kids have genetic SNPs, genetic alterations. They're called single nucleopeptides. And they have additional burdens where they just can't metabolize these nutrients. So what we have to get back to, and which is what we talk about with Regeneration International and all our organizations, is regenerating the soil, because the plants are deficient. So even if you are eating organic, which these kids in our schools clearly are not, organic food may not have chemical inputs, but they may be nutrient poor. So without that enriched soil, regenerative soil, we need to rebuild. And that's via the microbiome, soil microbiome, human microbiome.
Yeah, it's the same thing. To feed the soil, the same things you need to feed the humans to heal them, right? You have to heal the soil first, and then you get the healthier food, which can then work to help the gut. So it all goes back to the soil. I've really become aware of the importance of nutritious soil.
I want to add on to the anecdotal part of the story that I mentioned earlier. Speaking of feeding and restoring the gut, so this was several years ago that I got this story, but from a mom who lived in Santa Ana, low income neighborhood. She called me because her best friend was Spanish speaking. And so she called to relay the story to me. And the Spanish speaking mom, single mom of 4 kids, low income, had a child who, when he was 9 years old, he had mental health issues. And she told the school and they didn't do anything about it. And then one day they called her and said, you need to pull your son out of school. He just threatened to blow the school up with a bomb and kill everybody in it. And she said, well, I told you that he has mental health issues and I need help. So they sent him to I never know, is it a psychologist or a psychiatrist? The one that can administer drugs.
Psychiatrist.
A psychiatrist, thank you. So they sent him to a psychiatrist with the mom, and the psychiatrist said, okay, here's your prescription after, reviewing the child. And the mother said, well, that's it? What about like what's causing this and with the side effects? And like, he's just going to take this drug for the rest of his life. And he said, well, have you considered what's in the food? What are you feeding him? And she said, I don't like, chips and burritos and hot dogs and pizza, like whatever I can get into him, he's a very picky eater, like whatever he'll eat. And so he said, well, you can either consider the toxins, like the food dyes and the chemicals and all of that's in the food, or you can give him this prescription. Like you can either go organic or give him this prescription. And so she went organic. She found a way to buy rice and beans on a very limited budget. And within 2 weeks, one of the teachers at the school called her and said, we don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it because this is a completely new child. Wow. And at the time of the call, she said he is now, I don't remember what it was, 16 or 17 years old, but he's of the age where he's just about could go out and get a gun and shoot up the school. And she called me because it was like a week after a recent shooting. I'm not sure which one. There's been so many of them. And she said, I just want you to know that I'm clear that my son will not get a gun and shoot kids at his school because we went organic and we took the toxins out of a diet. But if I had not done that, and organizations like yours were not sharing about, GMOs and toxins and all these other groups were not sharing about it, I think he would have done that. And hundreds of kids' lives would have been affected. Thousands of people would have been affected. And so she just really wanted me to know that her son was healthy now and responsible. And he was even helping to start school gardens at his school. Yeah, he works on community gardens. They grow food for the schools. I mean, it's just like such a heartwarming story, And so when I talk about eating organic and looking at the toxins in the food supply, I really mean it when I say that this can alter lives forever. This kid has a new future because his mom's found out about the food, what's going on in the food supply, and everybody at his school has a new future because of that, right? Like
that's so great.
Had a very different future. So, I mean, as a doctor or a scientist, what else can we do to get the parents and maybe other doctors or somebody, the government, to support testing for nutrients and raising awareness about this issue? I mean, we're what else can we do here?
I can chime in with one local anecdote here, and then we can hear from you, Stephanie. Locally, there was a group here that started organic foods in our local schools in my county, and they had this one school that wasn't performing well. They put an organic garden in. They had local chefs come in and cook with the kids. The kids were chef ambassadors. They had a beautiful garden there, and the program was a smashing success. UCSF came in to study the program, and within 1 month of instituting this new garden and a change in the food, attendance went up, improved attendance rates, a decrease in absenteeism, behavior, and visits to the principal's office went down. This was a primary school. This group took this program to a lower income area, even more lower income, and where the kids were eating 2 to 3 meals a day at school. And again, 1 month in, great success. Kids are loving these lunches. Who stopped it in that school? The union. The school, the food union felt threatened by loss of jobs, and they stopped the program, even though the workers in the kitchen of this food union, their own children were in the program.
Wow.
So we have a political piece to work out as well. But no doubt, these conversations, we hope, inspire parents to get involved at the local community level, because that's where it all begins. Community level gardens in their own schools, and say, here, look at Zen's study. Here are these folks, a doctor, a scientist reporting on it. What are we doing at our school? And what can we do? Because I did a comparison lecture on school lunches from around the world, and we were lower than countries like Brazil, Ukraine, Greece, Turkey, and the best lunches were from France, where kids were arguing about whether they liked the manchego or the brie. Can't make this up. They had a cheese course. In France, they had cooked food at tables, and when they were given American school lunches to sample, they all went, ew. It was, and I saw a video of it. It's real. So we can do better. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to add anything in there as well.
Well, first of all, I think that's so fantastic. And it seems so great to integrate education about how to grow food by having the kids actually participate in growing food at the school, growing organic food and then eating it. Can't think of anything better to teach the children, to make them understand the importance of healthy food, and then to benefit from it because they are able to eat the food that's the product of their own efforts. I think it's an extremely good lesson for the children. It should be part of the public school program across the board, I would say. And I want to get back to the serotonin issue with the violent behavior, because I have suspected for quite some time now that glyphosate is a major player in the epidemic we're seeing in the school shootouts. And in fact, many people have pointed out that many of those kids who go berserk and go and kill people they don't know are on SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That is a very popular drug to treat very, emotional problems and psychological problems. It's a very popular drug and drug class, this SSRIs. And what they do is they prevent the serotonin from going back after it's released into the synapse so that it lasts longer. And that's a way to kind of get around the serotonin deficiency problem. But the problem is, of course, that eventually becomes a serotonin deficiency on steroids. It makes the serotonin deficiency problem worse, especially if you're not getting the drug. So your body becomes very reliant on that drug to keep forcing the serotonin to stay in the synapse. So the underlying problem is a serotonin deficiency problem. And if you fix that problem, you fix the violent behavior, and you fix that problem by going on an organic diet. So all of that makes a lot of sense to me.
And those microbes produce serotonin, and 80% of the serotonin is produced in your gut.
I know, that's right. And it's sulfated before it's shipped to the brain. And the sulfation problem is also wrecked by glyphosate.
So, you have this deficiency, but you also have a deficiency of gut microbes. You're not producing enough serotonin. There's a whole field of therapy now called psychobiotics, where they're making probiotics specifically to deal with this, to produce the serotonin and improve mood. But I'm thinking yeah, that's great. But what about we get to the root cause on why the microbes aren't making serotonin is that we're killing them off with what's in the food, glyphosate,
exactly.
Herbicides. And I have to point out, this is a sidebar and we can talk about and get into it. And I know this paper that came out in 2019, Stephanie, which showed how glyphosate causes autism in rats, or maybe they were mice, actually. I forgot which kind of rodent, using this soluble epoxide hydrolase enzyme pathway. The mechanism was laid out. And what the paper suggested is we'll just inhibit this pathway in a drug, and then we can prevent the way a glyphosate is causing, not correlating with autism. It's wait a minute. Can we just remove the glyphosate, the root cause medicine? This is not rocket science, folks. It's take away the poison.
But then they wouldn't make money on the drug, on the
I know. It's actually coming and going. I think that the agrochemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry are the same thing. It's the same companies. Like Bayer is the one that offers the glyphosate now. And I think they understand that as long as they continue to poison the population, they're going to make plenty of money off their drugs. Some of the companies offer a poison that causes a problem, that they have a drug that fixes that problem. They offer both, so they've got you coming and going.
Yeah, a good example of that is AstraZeneca and Syngenta, right? Syngenta makes the largest number of pesticides in the world, and their sister company is AstraZeneca. And AstraZeneca has at least 400 different medications that treat the very symptoms that their pesticides cause. And when I went to Syngenta and sat down with the research and development women on their team and talked to them about this, they looked aghast. They looked like they didn't get that was what was actually happening. And I was like, no, I don't know if it was an act or not. But
I know it's
they looked like, oh, but we don't do that. I'm like, but yes, you do. Look at all of these medications that you have that treat the very same symptoms as the pesticides. And they looked very uncomfortable with that. They did stop. They said they lowered the amount of glyphosate that they were selling the next year. I don't know if it was correlated or not, but I am glad, Alexis, that you're hosting women to talk about this, because I feel like our voices have just been so, muted about this. I mean, I have to mention Barbara Stitt. She's a Lifetime Achieving Award winner that wrote a book called Food and Behavior, The Natural Connection. She did a 20-year study on parolees, and it was one of the first books that I read about food and behavior. And she studied, like, for instance, dropouts in a college with 5,000 students. There were 500 kids that were dropping out in high school. And after they got Whole Foods, took out the soda and the chips and all that stuff, and Whole Foods. And this was in the late 90s. So I don't think she knew that she was taking out GMOs and chemicals so much, but it was Whole Foods that they put in and took out all the sodas and junk. That number dropped to 14, from 500 to 14. And the same thing with the parolees. Usually it's about 70% recidivism rate. They go back to prison. Well, that reversed. 70% stayed out of prison, and only 30% came back when they had Whole Foods in the prison. And when she talked to the serial killers and the parolees, the criminals, and found out what they had in common, it wasn't their socioeconomic background like a lot of people would imagine. It wasn't that they were from low income. It was that they bragged that they lived on junk food. They were like, oh, all I eat is Coke and Hot Pockets, or, although I don't want to get something from Hot Pockets, but just an example, like they bragged that they lived on, pizza and chips and soda and junk food. And that was the thing that they had in common. So she knew, this was decades ago, that the deficiency of the vitamins impacted their brain and how the decision-making that they did and their quality of life and their success in life. So I have to say, I'm kind of frustrated that people aren't listening, that this is what's happening, and think that I'm insensitive because I'm mentioning the food. Like, what are these shooters eating? What are these serial killers eating? And they think, oh, Zen, you can't just chalk this up to food. Well,
right.
maybe we can.
Yeah, maybe we can, right? Yeah, and it's good that you brought up the whole issue of these, what I call pseudo foods, because, one of the things, you get all kinds of complicated molecules from plant-based foods. And all these plants produce all these exotic molecules that are, like quercetin, all these different that are often herbs, herbs and spices. These things have really interesting molecules in them that support our health in ways that we don't understand. And we think of vitamins, we got the B vitamins, the C vitamins, we know all those vitamins, but there's much, much more than vitamins in those whole foods. And when you basically process them into starches and sugars and fats, and protein, and you mix them up and make a soy protein bar, that is not at all the same thing. You have lost a lot of the nutritional value that is not measured in vitamins and minerals. It's more than that.
It's this tags on to two political things that are happening. And one of them is this plant-based drive right now from foods like Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, Crickets, I don't know, whatever the drive is, these industrial food-like products that they're either full of the GMO, like the Impossible Burger, or they're just full of legumes that are filled with pesticides, like, pea, soy proteins, et cetera, et cetera. The legumes are really high in glyphosate because they are filled with chemicals, mostly glyphosate-based herbicides, because they're used as a crop desiccant at the end of the crop growth, and then they dry out the crops with Roundup and other glyphosate-based herbicides. So we're pushing, especially kids, millennials, young people who want to eat more plant-based diets, on these plant-based pseudo foods, and those are not real foods. And I'd say stay away from those. So that's one problem. The other problem is medical education, and that the medical education is devoid of anything that's nutritional or non-pharmaceutical. And if it's non-pharmaceutical, then it's not real science. So we have to debunk this myth that nutritional medicine is not real medicine. And that stems from Rockefeller. And boy, we can go back 110 years to look at where that came from. But that is the present model in our medical system. And so when those of us talk about nutrition-based medicine, it's not real medicine. And we talk about this stuff, we're not being science-based. I said, really? Zen and Stephanie are not being science-based? I don't think so. Have you tried to read Stephanie's work? Let me know how. So these are the political and academic challenges that we have to break down these barriers. And the way that we like to go around it, I think we can all agree here, is to the moms and dads, to the parents, on how we create a ground up, roots up, grassroots level movement. And that's what we're trying to do, is get right to the people who are eating.
Absolutely. I've long since really almost given up on the government. And it's sad to say that, because I used to be proud to be an American, and it's been a long time since I was proud to be an American. I have to confess, I'm just so upset with our government for their willing blindness to this problem when they see the autism rates going up every year. And it's not something they even talk about. They're just denying that there's a problem. And meanwhile, they're poisoning the population, and somehow they think that's fine. And I don't understand that. I find it criminal.
I have to add that when I was releasing this information, I confessed to a friend that I said, it's not just that this food is so poisoned that bothers me, that disturbs me, like to my core, that like, if I think about it, I'm just going to weep for days. It's that the majority of the politicians that learn this information are going to ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a betrayal at the deepest level. That disturbs what, I know men are concerned about safety too, but women are incredibly concerned with safety, right? Like if we don't feel safe, we have a hard time functioning in our relationships. We have a hard time trusting. We have a hard time being peaceful and happy. And, when mama ain't happy, nobody's happy, right? So when you've got a lot of unsafe women walking around because their government isn't doing their damn job, you've got a lot of unhappy people and a lot of unhappy families and husbands and kids because mom's not happy. So, it's really very disturbing that our politicians and our elected officials aren't doing anything about this. And, recently glyphosate was ordered, the Supreme Court ordered the EPA to come to a decision by October 1st. Hello, it's October 6th. Have they come to a decision? No, they said we need another 4 years. They're ignoring a Supreme Court order. So, they're pulling shenanigans like this. Meanwhile, moms across America, we had like 10,000 moms call the EPA when we found glyphosate in breast milk, right? Like we met with the EPA for like 4 times. We've had congressional hearings in the government. And Alexis, all about working in DC with the government on this. But and we did have actually one EPA staffer that said to us, we encourage you to communicate the moms with us by any means necessary. Somebody in there did want us to, hammer them with emails and calls and communications. And there were some people in there that wanted us to communicate with them. That person in particular was switched from the department. After that, is in a different department now. And the other one that I had any kind of conversations with as well is in a different department now. But, I do believe there are good people in the government, and we still do need to hammer them with this information, but we can't wait for them.
Right.
We have to keep, on it, and we have to keep raising awareness about this because they're just taking too damn long.
Yeah, and we can do the problem. We can solve the problem by ourselves. And I think with people refusing to buy the food, the toxic food, and insisting on organic, certified organic, and that's pressuring the farmers too, because then the farmers say they won't buy our food, so we better grow something else. I think it can really work down to pressuring the farmers to change their ways. For Americans to produce more organic, we have to import a lot of our organic food because there's so much more demand than there is supply. And I want to give a shout out for Mexico, because Mexico has decided they're going to ban glyphosate, period, I think starting in 2024. And our government is pressuring them left and right to try to get them to back down on that. This is what makes me very sad about American politicians, is that we seem to be not only ignoring the problem, but working in the opposite direction to try to prevent other countries from doing what they want to do to help solve their own food crisis.
Yeah, for Mexico, it's 2023, and they receive a significant amount of imports from U.S. to Mexico of GMO corn. And Vilsack, the revolving door Vilsack, who's met with Mexico to pressure them to change their policy about not accepting our product anymore. Corn is king in Mexico, and Zen and I did a recent whole day with International Day of Corn celebration last week. So this is big. Now, this EPA thing, can you imagine if they were in our businesses and they said, yeah, we can get that report out to you in 4 years? They'd be fired.
Mm-hmm.
I said, fire them. That is incompetence. It's gross incompetence. A report, I think, should have it done in a week.
They have enough science, Stephanie? How many studies do you think are there about glyphosate right now showing harm to animals and humans?
And they're coming out left and right, by the way. And in fact, really interesting new studies are showing transgenerational effects, that when the grandmother is exposed to glyphosate at small amounts while the mother is in utero, then the child has effects that show up from that exposure way back then. Transgenerational effects through epigenetic mechanisms.
And
really
when we brought that study to the EPA with Dr. Zach Bush, probably 2 years ago, we were told that legally they cannot consider transgenerational, like multi-generational studies. They can only consider that impact of that one generation. Yeah, it's ridiculous. But I have to ask, is it, just for the viewers, is it a couple dozen studies about glyphosate? Is it a couple hundred, or do you think that it's reached 1,000 studies now about glyphosate showing harm?
Yeah,
what do you think?
I imagine there are 1,000 studies out there. Some of them may not be. I think it's really the more recent ones, and I think there's been a change since 2012, and I want to give Seralini credit for that. Professor Seralini in France, when he did that long-term study on the rats, where he exposed them to low-dose glyphosate for their entire life, and also the GMOs, and he found harm, but he didn't see any damage after 3 months. And of course, the industry said you only have to look for 3 months in animal studies. If you don't see anything after 3 months, you're good to go. That's how they could get out of, seeing the toxicity that glyphosate causes. It's a slow kill. And Seralini found by the end of the experiment, they died young. They had reproductive issues, both the males and females. The males had obvious damage to the liver and the kidneys. The females had massive mammary tumors. All kinds of things happened over the course of the lifetime of these rats. And that was an epiphany, I think, for a lot of the researchers, because I think many people people who are in the toxicology business, they're like, well, I'm not going to study glyphosate. Glyphosate's safe. Why would I waste my money studying something that I'm just going to get a negative result? Mm-hmm. But once he showed that low-dose glyphosate is not safe, then you started seeing all these low-dose experiments showing that it's not safe, like the liver study that I mentioned earlier. Lots of things are coming out. And then the ones that are looking at the subtlety of exposing the mother to glyphosate exactly in that period, they know when the fetus is very, very sensitive to toxic exposures, and to do it exactly there, and then to look and see what happens to future generations. Those kinds of studies have only come out in the last few years, and they're finding obvious effects. And so as they look, they find, and once they find, more people look. And I think that's what's happening right now. There was a study on the female babies that came out recently that was looking at this measure, which is an anogenital distance. It's a metric for exposure to testosterone in utero. And they found this compared to the level of glyphosate in the urine of the mother while she was pregnant. Very straightforward study, statistically significant result. This problem that you see with the child is an indicator of polycystic ovary syndrome, which is an epidemic right now. Many women suffer from that, and it is the primary cause for infertility in women. And so I think that's a direct connection between glyphosate and infertility. And it's also connected to autism. People who have polycystic ovary syndrome have an increased risk to autism, and their offspring have an increased risk to autism.
We can add in there too, Stephanie, that when Dr. Seralini did those studies, he also found that there were high levels of heavy metals in the glyphosate-based herbicides, and Roundup, which is the glyphosate and the surfactants and all the proprietary secrets, were more toxic than just glyphosate alone, because these chemicals are formulations of many toxic substances, and their surfactants break down cell membranes, so the glyphosate is yet more toxic. So what they've done is they've rolled out 20 years of harm, and now we've had to spend years of our lives showing the harm and proving the harm, which is what happened to the precautionary principle. So they've hidden half the stuff proprietary, and now we've had to rediscover it and what they put in there and the harm it's done. And these untimed studies, in the Impossible Burger study, they only studied those rats for 1 month. And like a few of them died. So this Seralini, thank you, because he studied the rats for 2 years, and they only studied juvenile rats. We're eating GMOs based on a 3-month study of juvenile rats. That's it. And there are only 3 studies on health on just GMOs, not GMOs and associated pesticide. 3 human studies, as far as I know. Stephanie, you might know one more, and they
I
all
don't.
and that is shocking that we're eating this for 25 years and no human studies except 3.
And
Yeah,
the EPA knows this, and they will admit it. When I was in a meeting with the EPA towards the end of the meeting, I said, "Do you have any long-term animal studies with blood analysis on Roundup?" And they said, "Which one? There's hundreds of different, formulations." I said, "Any of them?" They said no. Then I said, "Then how can you say that it's safe? How can you allow it on our food?" And they ended the meeting. So, people assume that this product that's sitting on the shelf, that they're spraying in their backyard and they're letting their kids run around barefoot over it, which just happened to one of my friends. Her son got cancer. Her father died. He was spraying Roundup on the back patio. They were part of the Monsanto lawsuit. The son lived, but the father did not. They assume it's safe because it's on the shelf. They assume that the government is doing their job. When a mother sends her child to school to eat a school lunch, she assumes that school lunch is going to be safe because the government is supposed to be doing their job. And they're not doing their job, and we are outraged about it. We have plenty of science. Michelle, you're saying that we have to rediscover. The problem is the EPA knows this. There's documents from the Monsanto trials, from people doing countless FOIAs, Freedom of Information Acts, and finding out what they're actually looking at. They know this, and they're looking the other way. So it's we really have to take matters into our own hands here, and that's what the school lunch testing was all about, and that's what all the research that in the books that you both have written is all about, and what Organic Consumers Association and Regeneration International is all about is bringing the truth. So I really appreciate being able to speak about this.
And I am so grateful that you did this because it's long overdue. And I hope you shame the government into doing more and then to recognizing that they need to change their policy with regard to school lunch. It's such a great opportunity for the government to offer healthy food to the students, to the population, the children of our country. There's no better way to give them good nutrition than to feed them a healthy lunch at school. And they're not doing it.
And please
they should be shamed into doing it.
And please don't consider ketchup and apple juice. They are in 2 fruit groups on school lunches: apples and ketchup. I read it myself. This is true.
I have to mention the apples had some of the highest levels of pesticides.
Right.
The fruit and the study.
And it's apple juice, which is a sugar water, and ketchup, more sugar with a little bit of tomato. So we have to say enough. Enough is enough. And maybe this would be a good time for Alexis. You want to maybe put the drawstring on this conversation and kind of wrap it up, because I think we've hopefully made the point to the listeners. Thank you, Regeneration International. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Zen, and Alexis, of course. Thank you. So maybe this would be a good moment.
Yeah, well, there's a lot more to be done. And I hope that everyone will follow Moms Across America.
Well, it's cutting out for a little bit for me, but you said something about next steps. I would just suggest that people go to momsacrossamerica.org, and also Children's Health Defense. They did fund half of the testing. So we really appreciate Children's Health Defense and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the entire staff there. So go to momsacrossamerica.org or children'shealthdefense.org and get the information. We do have a letter that we would ask for you to send to your senators and the representatives and the USDA. We would think it would be a badge of honor, like a really good thing for a senator or representative to, push a bill through to have safer, healthier, non-toxic, nutrient-dense lunches. That would be a no-brainer. So, but they need to hear from thousands of us. So please go into our blog and to, Moms Across America and click on that to sign a letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Zen. And I'll take over from Alexis. Her internet must have went poof. Stephanie, how can people learn more about what you're doing and give any links to the listeners?
I have my webpage, stephanieseneff.net. And my book is Toxic Legacy. I actually have it here, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. And this is soon going to be available in paperback. So I'm excited about that.
It's a great book. And Michelle, what about your websites?
So yeah, you can come visit us at drmichelleperro.com. I have lots of information on the parent ed section. We just launched Regeneration Health International. Stephanie is one
Right.
of our fabulous advisors. I'm going to loop Zen in very shortly. Zen doesn't even know it yet. You guys are going to hear how we're going to get Zen in the mix. So we're working on food as medicine, of course, and solution-based. Enough belly aching, we're going to fix it. And gmoscience.org, my baby, been at it a long time. And the next book will be out 2023. Say a prayer for me, making our children well.
Awesome.
Great.
Yeah, yeah.
Great.
Well, I'm going to just say thank you, everyone. Thank you, Zen, Stephanie, Alexis. Thank you. Thank you, Regeneration International. Thank you, Global Food Day. And we really enjoyed being with all of you here today. And we're going to say ciao, and we'll be back.
Sure thing.
Thanks so much for watching. To see the next clip, please go to facebook.com/regenerationinternational/live.